Welcome to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast. I'm Christian Walmer, an author and journalist who has covered transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we try to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments, and interviews in the transport world. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades looking at transport policies and legislation. So, Mark, what are we covering today?
Hello, Christian, and hello to our listeners. Now, loyal listeners will know that you've been travelling much around the world in recent episodes, bringing us reports from Japan, India, and China on exciting developments in the provision of transport and, in particular, rail transport. But for this episode, we're back in these islands, firmly in these islands and in the great nation of Wales, where you have been speaking to Mark Barry, the Professor of Practice in Connectivity at Cardiff University, who is widely regarded as the creator of the South Wales Metro, which is well on the way to transforming transport provision in and around the Cardiff Capital Region. And you've been speaking to Mark about how that project has come about, but also about some of the other exciting developments on transport in Wales.
Things are happening in Wales, and I wanted to find out how it's going because they've instituted an amazing system of tram trains on the old Cardiff Valleys line. And really the instigator of this is Mark Barry, who I thought would be an excellent interviewee to tell us about this program and how it's going. So, Mark, tell me the story of this, because this was your idea many years ago.
So I guess it was my idea, although no ideas are purely original or originate in a vacuum. The conversation, if I start, for improved connectivity on the Valley lines was first set out way back in 1936 by Professor Marquand, who wrote a book called South Wales Needs a Plan. And this was written in the face of the decline of the coal industry in the 1920s and 30s. And there were two quotes in that book I use a lot in my presentations. One is, we need to, paraphrase, we need to better connect the heads of the valleys with Cardiff so that they can be connected like Wimbledon is connected to the City of London kind of thing. And we should consider electrifying the railways. This is 1936, by the way. We should also consider local government boundaries that best suit the challenges that we face today in 1936. And my contention would be that why is it taking us 90 years to do something? And
so just explain what the Cardiff Valley lines are and what they were built for.
Okay, well, that's probably a really good question because we're bequeathed, I think, fortunately, in Southeast Wales, especially north of Cardiff, with the legacy in terms of industrial archaeology of the rail network that was designed and built to move huge quantities of coal from the Rhondda Valley, the Cynon Valley, and Merthyr and the Rhymney Valley to Cardiff docks to export to the rest of the world. And Cardiff docks became the world's biggest coal exporting port before the First World War, and only to be shadowed by Barry just down the road in 1913. So the whole of the world was based upon energy produced by burning coal, and Cardiff was at the epicenter of that. And the rail network designed, developed, and implemented was to ship coal. Obviously, a lot of lines were closed as a result of beaching, but we were left with a legacy of a really old Victorian rail network that was carrying some people up and down the valleys to Cardiff, very depreciated, really hadn't had much investment, well, no investment of any scale since the Victorians built it. I can get into the whole politics of rail funding and Westminster and devolution, but I'll come back to that if we need to.
Right.
The network there provided an opportunity because the population of Cardiff and the valleys north of Cardiff, if you ignore the Gwent valleys, is nearly a million people, and we have this rail network that comes down from Rhymney, from Merthyr, from Aberdare, from Treherbert, via Pontypridd and Caerphilly into Cardiff, and then down to Penarth and Barry. So a very extensive network that was very, very depreciated and not really doing a good enough job of providing a public transport network.
But had survived it survived beaching, interestingly.
A lot of it did, much didn't. And actually, some credit must go to the old councils, Mid Glamorgan, South Glamorgan County councils in the 1980s, who reopened some lines. So the Aberdare branch was a freight line. That was basically jigged around with and reopened for passenger services, a train an hour in the late 1980s. The City line in Cardiff was never a passenger line. That was converted by South Glamorgan County Council with British Rail to 1 train an hour, 2 trains an hour back in the late 80s. So there was this legacy there, a network that was frankly very underutilized, but really lacking investment to do something more useful.
And as far back as the 1930s, people were talking about this.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the conversation goes back to the 1930s. So the fact that I kind of brought it all together with my report in 2011, which kind of kicked it all off again, I really tip my hat to previous conversations and previous efforts. There was a proposal, even in the 1990s, as part of the Cardiff Bay Development Corporation, to turn some of the Valley lines to light rail and link it to the Bay Line. I believe it was the Strategic Rail Authority at the time that basically killed that, even though they could see what was happening in Manchester, with and Sheffield and Croydon was going to come on stream. The proposals in South East Wales and Cardiff were killed.
You produced a report as who? Who were you? And what was your locus?
Well, let's take a little step back. So I've got a very unusual background, Christian. I'm not a transport planner by trade, although I'm professor of practice in connectivity at Cardiff University now, 1 day a week. I was never a civil servant. I've had 3 careers. The first 10, 15 years of my career, I was a software designer, developer, management consultant, building, design and implementing major software systems in London and around the world. So I worked in London, I worked in Milan, I worked in the US, design databases. I then spent 7 years as a biotechnology entrepreneur. I started a company in Cardiff, raised equity finance in London, and I dealt with all of the difficulties startup entrepreneurs have in raising capital for a pre-revenue or early revenue technology company. And it was after I left that business in 2010, I thought, you know what, I've always known that the economy of South East Wales has been held back by poor public transport. I'm going to get involved in the idea of writing or doing something to make it happen. I wrote a little article for the Institute of Welsh Affairs that became a 10,000-word report. Because I come from the business community and I wasn't a civil servant or a transport planner, I knew via my brother, who was business editor of the Western Mail, Sean Barry. I got to know people like David Stevens, who was the founder of Admiral Insurance, the £1 billion company based in Cardiff. I got to meet the Cardiff Business Partnership, who thought, wow, this is a great idea. So we ended up merging our efforts. So I worked with the business community in Cardiff.
But you did that as a private individual. You had no particular locus, really. Right.
No, I was not funded. I wasn't funded to do this. I was doing it off my own back.
You just produced this report, right?
I produced this report, but because of my network, I don't know how I managed to know, Terry Morgan, who was the chairman of Crossrail at the time.
Right.
I knew Jim Steer, because I've been dealing with Green Gauge because I was interested in the high-speed rail debate. I knew, and I knock doors and see people. I don't care what level I'm at. So I knew people running Network Rail and River Trains Wales. So I launched this report. I talked to Cardiff Council. I said, can I have City Hall for a day? They went, okay. I had City Hall for a day, got the press in, the TV in. And we had Jim Steer, we had Terry Morgan, we had David Stevens, we had me. We talked about the idea of a metro in South East Wales, published a report. And I think it just captured the imagination. I think Welsh government probably thought, who the hell is this? What's going on? Where did this come from? But by the time I released the genie from the bottle, it kind of got a life of its own. And I became, for a number of years, the name associated with the project. And I ended up working with business groups, stakeholders, and Welsh government and others for a number of years to move it to the point something might happen. And I wrote my book, How to Build a Metro, describing a lot of that backstory, the advocacy, the conversations, the political discussions, the stakeholder engagement, all the things that are necessary way in advance before a politician will sign off and say, let's spend some money on this thing. I think a lot of people need to understand, or need to appreciate, when someone announces a project like High Speed 2 or Crossrail or South Wales Metro, it wasn't that they woke up that morning and thought, you know what, I'll do this today. It's based upon years of advocacy and work and lobbying and working with stakeholders and initial technical development to get to the point a civil servant can advise a minister to do something that really is frankly very, very difficult. And I work behind the scenes and in Welsh government dealing with what the inertia of the bureaucracy of government, which is, it's in Wales and in Whitehall, we all know about that. Yeah. How do you overcome the resistance of an organisation to do big strategic things, which is, the civil service is not greatly strategic. It is much more, in my view, tactical. So for the Welsh Government, for Cardiff and Jones to kind of get on board in 2015, it took another 5 years from my first report to get to the point we're going to do this.
But hold on a sec. This has big lessons for other campaigners, doesn't it? I mean,
yeah.
what before we go into the details of actually what's happened, just what was the key to your ability to go from a report? Okay, it took you 4 or 5 years, but to something that then became possible and then became probable and then happened.
Okay, let me say, I think 2 key things. One is, without really knowing about transport appraisal or transport planning, I set out a vision. But the vision was big picture. It had blurry edges. It didn't have specific details of specific schemes. And it was focused on the benefits to the economy, to decarbonisation, to regeneration, to development. It was about this could do this kind of thing in South East Wales. The impacts could be more jobs, greater connectivity, lower carbon emissions, greater development. And words I didn't even know what they meant then, transit, origin development, all those kind of things. But one thing I've learned since, because it was a big picture vision, it was easy to sell. And because it had blurry edges, you could flex the vision and the detail as you flew through it over the next few years. So what I found was important, I then spent, and this is the second part that's important, I went and presented to every local authority chief executive in South East Wales. I met every leader. I presented at conferences. I wrote in the press, in the media, via my brother, via the trade press, via TV, via radio. I produced another report. I got stakeholders talking. I talked to everybody every day about this project for years, to try to make it happen. And I think the key thing I found is, at one point it was clear that, and this is the key attribute, everybody politically who had influence was saying they wanted a metro, but no one could tell you exactly what it was. And that's that.
So that was a positive, was it? That was positive. Yes. Oh, right.
I think it's a huge positive, because you don't get hung up on a particular manifestation. Right. You don't say it's got to be this route, that thing. It was all about the benefits, the outputs, and the impact. And everybody wanted that. And I said, well, it's going to be a mix of light rail, heavy rail, integration, integrated fares, information. It will link to development. And so what happened was, in 2013, the minister then, Edwina Hart, commissioned me to do something called the Metro Impact Study, and they did throw a lot of money at me. And I led a multidisciplinary team with lots of advisors and challenge to look at what the Metro could do in a much more quantitative stroke qualitative way than my original.
So this is the first time you've got a bit of money to do something.
Yeah, this is the first bit of serious money, which Welsh government, I led it. And it took about 8 months, and I had Capita, Jones Lang, the Self and Property. I had the Urbanist, a good Cardiff Urban Development Company. I got Steer involved, and a few others. I can't remember all the names involved. But that was a very broad brush. What could the Metro do? What might it look like? So we did a bit of mode study, a bit of what is it going to be tram? That's when we first properly looked at tram train. And that was based upon earlier work from Network Rail. A guy called Gary Drazy had done some work with Network Rail and Cardiff Council a few years earlier. But that report was a very robust piece of work. It's on the Welsh Government website. There were several volumes, and it was issued to every member of the Senedd. We did press, TV. I did a documentary with BBC Wales week in, week out to talk about the Metro. This basically created a huge amount of evidence upon which you could then try and work with the civil service to move the project forward. I was then invited in by the minister to go and work in Welsh Government part-time to lead the project. Now, my naivety, which was exposed a lot in this process, I thought, great, we're off. You get inside the civil service and you realize no one's talking about the Metro. Right? There's an external world and an internal world.
Right.
And it became very clear to me that I'd have to be a lot more Machiavellian to work with the constraints of the bureaucracy of the civil service to get to a point. Someone could write a briefing for the minister to say, Minister, we need to spend £750 million on a project over which you have no statutory powers, well not devolved, over which we have no capability, we probably lack the funding, and it could go very wrong with huge damage and impact on the reputation of Welsh Government. So I had to get to a point, a civil servant could write that down to a minister, and a minister could acknowledge all those risks and still say yes.
So your report came out when?
My first report came out in 2011. The Metro Impact Study was in 2013.
Right.
I then spent 2.5 years part-time in Welsh Government trying to basically shake the tree, trying to make, right. And the one thing I had in my favour is I probably didn't behave as a civil servant should behave. In fact, I know I didn't. I went behind people's backs. I had conversations I shouldn't have. I told people things they shouldn't hear. But a few years later, I was invited to do a presentation to I think, a fast-track bunch of civil servants in London. I said, it's very important, I think, to make things happen. You need at least one person on the inside whose focus is making the thing happen, not the process or the bureaucracy. My focus was on making the thing happen. I didn't care about the rules or what was the right thing to do. I thought, if I don't do this, if I don't talk to that person behind that person's back and brief them in this way or get this information, then the bureaucracy of government will slowly strangle it and slowly and completely wrap it and kill it.
So what was the key go ahead? When did you know that you probably won?
Right. Let's step back again. Yeah. I couldn't have done this without someone like James Price, who was the head of that department. Now, James, I think, always wanted to do this, but he had probably two hands behind his back because he's had to follow the Civil Service Code. Right. And he couldn't advise. He couldn't make things happen.
Sorry, he was a civil servant in where?
In the Welsh Government's Transport Department. He's now Chief Executive of Transport for Wales and doing a remarkable job on delivering a metro. But at the time, we were like two sides of the same coin. There was a bit of tension, I think, between us because I basically ignored the rules. He had to follow all the rules. What he managed to do in parallel with my Machiavellian efforts to get civil service in the right place, he managed to broker a deal with the minister with London for some funding for an enhancement of the Valley Lines. If you remember, there was a commitment to electrify the Valley Lines, which would have been traditional EMU, 25 kV, cascaded trains. That fell apart. It was unaffordable and the wrong solution, and the benefits was very marginal. He was then trying to do a deal to get some money into Wales to allow us to do something on the Valley Lines. I don't think he thought what I was proposing was possible, but I think with my efforts to kind of open the vision on what the art of the possible, and him managing to broker the deal with other people involved, got to a point in 2015 where, and I went behind his back and the minister's back and I had a chat to the First Minister, where everyone thought, do you know what, this is really hard, but we can try this, we can do this. And I think Carwyn was the focal of that conversation. He should take a lot of credit for making that political decision to take on what, in Wales, is a very difficult thing to do because we still do not have statutory powers over rail, and we had to work within the constraints of the rail franchising and the Rail Act in 2005 or 2004. Right. It wasn't like in Manchester, you could take it away, cut it off, slice it, turn it off for 2 years, and bring back a light rail network. You had to work within the constraints of the heavy rail statutory framework.
Right.
And Carwyn did that and basically allowed James to basically say, go on, off you go. I'm supporting you. I'm taking this risk. And I think that was a hugely important intervention. And I think James will tell his own story. I think it then freed up James and the team to really go at this. And I think in the time since, they've done a remarkable job, frankly. I don't agree with everything we've done. And, nobody gets everything they want, but everybody gets something.
We'll come to that in a minute. But yeah, so that's the process. And so just give me some more dates. I mean, when did you get the actual go ahead? When did work start and stuff?
Right. Well, I don't think you ever get the final thing done until the contracts are all signed and someone's got a shovel, right? But So for me, the big political tipping point was when Carwyn basically said we're going to do this. That was early in March 2015. In October 2015, I helped a big press launch of the Metro at Pontypridd Station. I was there, the First Minister was there, all the leaders of the local authorities in South East Wales were there. I wrote another document called Road and Out Our Metro, which Welsh Government published, and my name's not on it, a Welsh Government document. That then enabled the creation of Transport for Wales. There was an agency agreement with the DfT to allow them to basically procure, independent of the DfT, the franchise, and we widened the scope, and we had this, I never liked it, a mode agnostic procurement process. We let the industry decide. I think I knew what we wanted, but I think the only way to navigate the unions and government and the process was to make it more of a dialogue with industry. And that was it. It took me 2 years from going in, end of 2013, early 2014, a couple of years working the system to try with others as well, because I think, a lot of people have to point in the same direction for something to happen. And they often don't even know they're all working in the same direction. But you need that for something big like this to happen. Okay. And I always tell students there are more often great projects that sit on shelves and never happen. I always advise them to read The Prince by Machiavelli, as a guide to how you influence and can encourage people to do things that they may not want to do. Right.
So you've basically got the go. So what did they start working on?
Well, essentially, Transport for Wales was established. So firstly, an organisation that could develop the capability to procure basically a £1 billion railway as part of the Wales and Borders franchising process.
Right.
So it became the most complicated rail procurement under the franchising regime that's ever happened. The biggest procurement in Welsh government history. So you need a team. So I left at that point. I went off. I joined one of the bidding companies. That's another side story. But what James had to do with the team and people like Jeff Ogden is build up a capability in an organisation that could basically procure something of this scale, and then organise and run what was nearly a 2-year procurement process in a way that was not challengeable and would give them a sensible outcome at the end. And they spent 2016 to 2018 doing that. And it wasn't perfect, but damn it, to go from a standing start at the end of 2015 to basically procuring this.
So what were they procuring?
Well, they procured outputs. They specified things like certain timetable requirements and station design and rolling stock requirements, but from a metro perspective, they let bidders come up with whether it was light rail, heavy rail, and mix, which bits were going to be covered. So there was a lot more flexibility, and there was something called I forget it was, a competitive dialogue process with each of the bidders. So there's a lot more to and fro. Normally you get, here's your tender, go away, come back in 6 months, give me your answer.
I remember this, yeah.
It was a lot, and as a result, it cost a lot more. There's a lot more effort involved. I do think, and I've written about this, and people can look at my book online, How to Build a Metro, some things that could have been done better. But frankly, 80/20, they ran that process and awarded eventually in 2018 the winning bid of Keolis Sami, even though I'd worked for MTR over the period. Right. But that's another story. That was really, amazing to go from no organisation 2.5 years later procuring, £1 billion of infrastructure and £800 million of rolling stock and a whole new franchise for the whole of Wales. That is phenomenal, I think. In speed.
Okay, so what have we ended up with, and what's happening now?
What we have now, James has done a few interviews, and I think you have to recognise that since then we had COVID, which had a massive impact on supply chains. We had the inflationary pressures. They've had certain supply chain issues with steel quality. But now we're probably under a year away from the rollout of the Metro, which will, in South East Wales, north of Cardiff, will be 4 tram trains an hour from the heads of the valleys, from Merthyr to Herbert Aberdare, 12 down from Pontypridd into Cardiff, probably 10 minutes off journey time. So the journey time today to Merthyr is probably an hour or just over an hour. That'll be down to 50 minutes or less, double the frequency. On the Rugby line, we're using the Trimos, the Flirt Trimo trains. So we have the light rail vehicles on one side and the heavy rail on the other side. Double the capacity, improve the reliability, and provide the foundation, especially with a tram train, which makes expansion easier, less costly, because you have much more flexibility.
Explain to our listeners what a tram train is, really.
Well, you could ask 1,000 people to get 1,000 different answers.
That's why I'm asking you.
So I'll give you my version. It's a piece of kit, rolling stock kit, that is cleared from a safety perspective to operate on mainline railways generally, but it also has the capability of behaving and working on non-mainline or tramway alignments. It has track brakes, so you can stop them much more quickly, like a tram, which would allow you to, run to tramway standards or use non-block-based signalling, line of sight signalling, which helps. But more importantly, because the vehicles are lighter and have a different axle setup, they can navigate tighter curves and steeper gradients. So Crossrail Phase 1A, for example, which is connecting the Bay Line to Central and hopefully then to the West, is only possible because it's a tram train. You could never really go in that alignment with a heavy rail vehicle, because you just, the curvatures and the buildings and the elevation issues would make it impossible. So future extensions or little spurs or whatever you want to do in future are much easier with tram train. It also is cheaper to operate.
But essentially, at the moment, these tram trains will operate on old national rail, heavy rail infrastructure.
Yeah. Right. I've got a bit of an issue with that. I would have preferred we de-designated the whole lot like Newcastle or Manchester. I don't want to get into it now, but I think the unions kind of influenced that. They were scared of driver-only operation. And we're going to have the only trams effectively anywhere with guards involved in dispatch operations, which I think adds cost. So we have cooked in higher unit cost for operation. What I think the tram train gives you in future, and I'm not going to say anyone should do this or not do this, but I do think we have to look at those kind of processes and procedures in future to take some of the operational costs out of these pieces of kit. So Cardiff Crossrail and expansion thereof, in my view, you shouldn't need a guard on every vehicle. You could have roving customer service staff with a lower number of staff than vehicles.
So there's going to be a guard on every vehicle?
Yeah. Heads of the valleys, I can get it. There's some antisocial behaviour issues. People are used to them. So I think some services you want that, but what I'd rather you had is much more flexibility in how you deploy your roving customer service staff, and maybe start to reduce your unit cost, because some of your shorter services, you don't need them. So Penarth, Corrigan or Caerphilly, you don't really need guards on those things, but we're going to have a guard. So I think in future, what the tram train offers you is to maybe look to make some choices on reducing operational costs, which I think will be important.
So where are we now? What has any of this been introduced yet? And what's
the key thing is the infrastructure, putting electrification up. So what we have is something called smart electrification, discontinuous electrification, because the new rolling stock have got batteries on board, so they can operate on the overhead or on battery. So it means you can reduce some of the costs, because they chose 25,000 kilovolts and not 750 volt DC, which is a lot easier in terms of civils. Because of 25 kV, you would have otherwise traditionally had to raise bridges or drop track, which is the most expensive part of the electrification process. If you can then have batteries on board and use discontinuous or permanently earthed sections, you can negate a lot of the civils that would otherwise be required, because the vehicles will operate on electric power, sometimes on battery or sometimes from the overhead. And the whole of the Valley Lines north of Cardiff now has been built with the infrastructure to enable that operation.
And is that the best solution, do you think?
I think given we stayed mainline, heavy rail standards, yes. Had we gone light rail and de-designated and gone for a Newcastle or a Manchester-based system, you could have gone for a lower voltage, which wouldn't have required the civils anyway. But again, choices were made. I mean, I'm not proposing we are where we are, and you look ahead. So we've got a very good solution, a very good rolling stock solution, which I think provides the foundation for the future, which is where I'm always focused on. There's no point looking over your shoulder. What are we going to do in the next 10 years?
And a lot of the rolling stock has now arrived.
Yeah, most of the tram trains, I think there's a few more still to be delivered. The challenge now, of course, you've got all these tram trains, you've got to commission and train all the staff to use them. So I still think they got 9 months of training and, whatever the terminology is, to get these things ready to be used and get all the staff cleared to operate these things. You'll probably start seeing the tram trains operating back end of this year. I think in full form with the extra frequency, the shorter journeys, probably middle of next year when they'll all be operating. And then people will go, and I do think people are generally cynical because people have never seen anything new and shiny. But they can now see some of the flirt tri-modes are operating. The tram trains aren't. And this is another poignant story. So the ex-minister Lee Waters was telling me that when they did a press launch of one of the Stadler flirts, I think about 18 months ago, they were at the Caerphilly station and all the dignitaries were there, the press were there, and there were some passengers waiting for the train. This shiny new train pulled in and all the passengers stepped away from the platform because they assumed, well, it can't be for us. That's too nice. That train is far too nice for us. We can't get on it. And they had to be told, no, this is for you. Right? And it just shows that, for years and years, there's been nothing new. We've been dealing with cascaded old paces, screeching wheels, rolling stock that's been used all over the place for years before. We've gone from the oldest average rolling stock age in the UK to the newest in 4 years. So that level of cynicism, I think, is deep. And I don't think people will really appreciate what they're getting until it's actually operating. And importantly, operating at the higher frequencies. The only gap, the only blip for me is that Cardiff doesn't get the same treatment, which is a bit of a bugbear for me. So there's two major lines in Cardiff, which have got very high population densities around them, will be stuck on 2 trains an hour. And anyone who knows the slightest about transport planning is nobody waits half an hour for the 15-minute trip, right? So I've been pushing very hard with Cardiff Council to get the funding required to fix the City line, which requires some work on Network Rail at Cardiff West, the Corrigan line, which needs a passing loop, and a bit what I call Crossrail Phase 2 to link the Crossrail Phase 1 to that network to create a high-frequency, more local service in Cardiff Penarth that will be attractive to passengers and actually drive more mode shift than probably most other schemes in the whole of Wales, given the population. So that's the one mission I know we'll sort out in due course.
But so the key thing is that this is still work in progress and there's kind of improvements and whatever that can be made.
I think you look at what Manchester introduced their trams, Ultralum middle of Manchester to Bury in 1992.
Yeah.
They ran that for a while. The expansion of that network since was enabled by those choices. And I think that, I've worked on, and with Transport for Wales, I helped set up their metro development programs around Wales. We've got a lot of schemes that, subject to funding, this is the challenge, we can then add to this. So I see an ongoing program to deliver more capacity. And going back to the very first point, why are we doing that? Two things. One is because of decarbonisation. We've got to basically treble the amount of public transport use. And the most efficient and capable way of doing that is expand our core rail network, integrate buses with that, but also the potential economic dividends in terms of regenerating places, especially valley towns, because of greater connectivity, and encouraging local authorities and development ecosystem to build more things around our stations, is a live opportunity that should run in parallel with the implementation of more transport services. So the opportunity now that we have, which I set out in that Metro Impact Study, is about, okay, how do we enable the wider benefits of the Metro investment in high street regeneration, in affordable housing, in access to work, in location of public services? These are all live questions the region's grappling with about how the planning system and the development system responds to this major, generational investment in our public transport network. So we're in a good place, I think. We really are.
Here's Christian's final thought from the Departure Lounge.
Well, we've just heard that the Labour government is proposing the idea that cyclists who kill pedestrians could theoretically be jailed for life. Now, I have no kind of problem with the fact that cyclists who behave badly should be punished and the like. The fact that the Labour government is bothering to give publicity to an issue that is incredibly rare. There's about one pedestrian killed every year by cyclists, and some years there's none, whereas there's several hundred pedestrians killed by drivers every year, and it's a much, much bigger issue. And I just think this is about priorities and the fact that there ought to be much greater emphasis on that. And indeed, there was just some publicity recently about a boy who was driving his car too fast with lots of other teenagers aboard, killed an 18-year-old girl on her birthday, and he got just 5 years. So, to then publicize the fact that you're going to jail cyclists for life, I think is just mistaken priorities.
Calling All Stations, the Transport Podcast with Christian Walmart, is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do follow us on social media channels, including Blue Sky, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle on X is @AllStationsPod.